Okay, I'm live. There are a few people online who say hi. Say hi to you. Let me see what's going on. Um, who knows? Um, just to let you know, I'm waiting for Ibrahim. He'll be with us. He is a long-term imam, and he is involved in his prayer session, which should end right about now. Usually takes him a few minutes to get on, but he's coming. I'm not concerned that I will miss him. And until he comes, I just kind of try to make a couple of comments why we do this, who we are, things like that, which we really hardly ever get into. Ibrahim and I, for the last 12 years, have been political commentators on Boulder, Colorado's public radio station, KGNU. They have a program that deals with international affairs. It's referred to as hemispheres. And once a month, a program that is produced by Jim Nelson, we're on. Occasionally, we're on more than that. Our focus has been what's going on in the Middle East, putting it into a geopolitical and global context, which is often missing, I find, from the discussions that people have about the Middle East. They tend to concentrate on, focus on the more limited issues, so the Palestinian question, Israeli occupation, the situation with Iran or Iraq. And our effort is to try to look at the bigger picture and how the different pieces kind of fit together when they do fit together. What that mostly consists of is really two steps. The first is deconstructing what we might refer to as the mainstream narrative, the narrative we get from, in this case, the Biden administration and the media. Although the point I want to make is that when it comes to the Middle East and actually foreign policy in general, the differences between the Democratic and the Republican administrations are minimal to non-existent. And so, if you're focusing on one and you think, well, the other is a great alternative, well, I think that's a mistake, a fundamental mistake, actually. All right, we've done interviews on other things on my channel, if you like, and you can find this both on my Facebook page. You can find these interviews and on my YouTube page. We've done about 10 of them. And this is the second. Oh, here's Ibrahim. Hi, Ibrahim. Let me let you in. All right. And I will stop the stream. There's Ibrahim.
Yeah.
All right. Let's just test a few things here, Ibrahim. Talk to me. Let's make sure that the volume and all that is right.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Your video is a little bit off. It's cuts you off at the chin. So that's better, much better. So welcome, Ibrahim. And,
thank you very much.
Yes. Actually, you made it right on time too. I started a few minutes early, gave people a little background of our history on KGNU. And I was starting, and I only take a minute to do this. Occasionally, we've done these interviews on other subjects, and we decided we wanted to do a several-part series on the war in Ukraine, or as the Russians refer to it, the special military operation. And part of the reason for this is the level of I don't know what other term to use, but hysteria over this war, the way that the mainstream narrative has been projected. And so we felt it would be of use to try to put the war in Ukraine into some kind of a more global context. It's not simply about Russia and the Ukrainians and their differences. Far from it. So this is our second program. I want to welcome everybody who's here, and tomorrow this war is going to be 4 months old. And here in the United States, the media and the Biden administration have focused on events starting essentially on February 24th, when the Russian troops went into Ukraine, without any historical or global context. So in this series, as I mentioned already, we're going to give a global context to the facts on the ground, without which we assert you really can't understand the war. So let's get right into it. Ibrahim, what do we mean when we're talking about global context?
Well, good evening to everyone. We briefly touched upon this in the first episode of this series of programs. At the moment, to put things into perspective, there are two types of narratives that dominates the discourse when it comes to the challenges in Ukraine. One that runs through in the United States and Western media that attribute the whole crisis, not only in Ukraine and around the world, to what they define as Putin's expansionist colonial mindset and expansionist policy, totally ignoring that his political events, particularly conflict, they do not come out of nowhere and happens in vacuum. The other narrative, or I call it the justification or explanation of the crisis, is it goes beyond and much further back than say February 24th, when the whole crisis started. It looks at world politics, particularly the relationship between West and East, or at least Russia and United States, and specifically NATO, but within the global context of single polar versus multipolar. And what I mean by single polar versus multipolar, single polar is what United States is attempting, or has been attempting, to establish around the world, in which it considers to be the only power in the world that can dictate to the rest of the world. And the multipolar, they say no, the time in which this kind of justification or this kind of ideology could have been served, or people did not say anything about it, are past. Now, what we have is multipolar, in which we recognize the independence of various players, major players around the world, and these major players will decide their own interests without dictation by United States. And in essence, they are rejecting the hegemonic power and the colonial power of United States, and to a degree the Western world, the rest of Europe, that are in cahoot with the United States. So when we talk about the global context, this is the challenge. Ukraine is not an event by itself. It should be contextualized into this dynamic. And once we contextualize Ukraine into this dynamic, we can we understand that the crisis didn't start in February 24, 2022. It goes way back. And there were a number of warnings coming out of Russia and other countries around the world, threatening, or at least reminding the West that expansionist policy by NATO and the single polar that the United States is trying to establish around the world is leading to huge amount of conflict and clash, which ultimately comes back to hurt everybody. Putin in 2007 and June 2022 made a reference to this challenges that exist between two ways of understanding the world or an ontological approach to the world. There is the United States or the Western power that they want to dictate as, call it hegemonic power, and the rest of the world, at least China, Russia, Iran, and a number of other countries that are resisting it. You want to add something, Rob?
Yeah, a couple of points. Recently, I've listened to those two Putin speeches that you referred to. The first speech was in 2007, March, I believe, 2007. It was in Munich, and the second speech was a few days ago at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, I think it's referred to. In both cases, the speeches begin with a criticism, if you like, of the U.S. attempt to maintain its hegemony, its unipolar control, if you like, or attempt to control the global economy. In the earlier speech, I found it quite interesting that within the context of trying to maintain cordial or positive or business-like relations with the United States, Putin came up with, in that speech, a whole variety of initiatives that the United States and Russia could cooperate on, starting with nuclear disarmament, to reinstitute some of the agreements which the United States has backed off on. But he goes on. It's a very, very concrete, and the criticism that is made of U.S. hegemony it's there, but when I listen to it, it's quite restrained, and it's the hand of peace or of cooperation is open. The speech that he gave a few days ago in St. Petersburg is quite different. It also begins with a criticism of the U.S. attempt to maintain its global hegemony. But really, quite frankly, it goes on from that. It's not even so much that he does defend, if you like, Russia's position to a certain extent, but mostly what he's talking about is how to build what Russia can do to build this multipolar world. And he's not even addressing the United States anymore, and he's not even not even addressing the Europeans. So I found that real interesting. He's moved beyond that. Yes?
Let me interject. For Russia, despite all the narratives that we hear in the West, that Russian economy, Russian this, Russian that, they are going to collapse everything, comparing it to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, etc., etc. For Putin, his position not only within Russia and the supports that he gets by Russian population, economically, militarily, he is in much stronger position than he used to be in, say, beginning of February 2022. So for him, United States objection and United States, say, imposition of sanction and everything else is passé. As he said in his June speech, the world is not going back. History doesn't go back. History moves forward. And the time of a hegemonic single polar that dictates to the rest of the world is over. What you said is quite correct. For Putin, America or US is no longer part of the equation because Putin sees history moving forward rather than going back.
Yes, and as part of in preparing for the program, one of the things I wanted to look at, well, what is U.S. global strategy? And there are a number of papers. I'm only going to go back to 1992. We could go back much earlier if we wanted to. But why 1992? Because it's the year after the collapse of the Soviet Union and of communism in Europe. And at that time, there was a group that started to emerge. They have a long history, quite frankly, but they came under the umbrella of the Project of a New American Century. And if you get to the core of what they're saying, is the United States is now not just a superpower, but they kept using this term hyperpower. And what their purpose is that the United States should maintain this position of dominating the global economy, the world, for as long as it can. And in order to do that, it has to prevent the emergence of a challenger, of an economic and political challenge. So that's a statement that came out in 1992. We see that same statement, if you like, with kind of a wrapping on it. It's referred to as the Bush Doctrine, although from what I've read, probably the guy who had the most influence on it was the vice president, Cheney. But he basically is saying the same thing. He takes it a little further, though. He specifically says that the United States should engage in preemptive strikes against potential rivals. And then in 2019, we have a national security policy, which is done by the military and the State Department and all that. They put it all together. And there, not only are we talking about preventing the emergence of a competitor and possibly taking military action, but in 2019, the two competitors are named. They're named as opponents, enemies in this document of the United States, and they are Russia and China. So, Ibrahim, how does NATO fit into Washington's effort to maintain its unipolar dominance? And what does that have to do with the war? What does NATO have to do with U.S. policy and with the war in Ukraine?
Well, to understand the role of NATO, we really need to go back, although one could go back to 1945-46 and the establishment of NATO, but the foundation of it goes back to, I believe, after the First World War, in which some kind of similar to NATO proposed by United States, Canada, Britain, and others, that they have to work together or come up with some kind of alliance that they would strangle the Bolshevik revolution and literally would suffocate it. That's what they wanted to do, to destroy the Bolshevik revolution. In 1945, similar kind of ideas came to exist. Although at the time it was supposed to be a defensive organization, protecting the West vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and what they called Soviet Union's aggression. But it worked as, well, it was to a degree considered to be a defensive organization because the Soviet Union's power and the Warsaw Pact as an opposition would not allow the NATO organization to venture into some kind of an aggressive position. Although it did it worked to a degree, but it was primarily after the 1990 fall of the Soviet Union when we begin to see NATO literally coming out into its own hegemonic and position, and that NATO becomes the extended arm of American foreign policy, which we have already talked about. American foreign policy is to maintain and strengthen the role of the hegemonic role of United States as the only power that dictates to the rest of the world. So NATO became the organization that worked with the United States, and we saw this in various countries. We saw it in Yugoslavia, we saw it in Bosnia, we saw it in Libya, we saw it in Iraq, we saw it in Afghanistan, we see it in Syria, Yemen, and other places.
We're seeing it in
NATO
Japan now.
What?
We're seeing it in Japan. Japan and NATO are now sharing intelligence.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
And Japanese Prime Minister was invited to attend one of these NATO meetings. So the idea or the supposition that says, or hypothesis that says NATO is a defensive organization is far from the truth. As a matter of fact, there were a number of even American political personalities that talked about the expansion of NATO towards towards Russia is going to cause huge amount of problem. One of them was the William J. Burns, that
Right.
now Biden CIA director.
Yeah.
From the moment that he was a junior officer in American embassy in Moscow until he became ambassador during Clinton. And after that, he has constantly reminded the United States that hostility to early NATO expansion is almost universally felt across the domestic political spectrum in Russia. And there were a few others in 1997 during the, I believe, Clinton's era. 50 prominent foreign policy experts signed an open letter to Clinton saying, "We believe that the current US-led effort to expand NATO is a policy error of historic proportion that would unsettle Europe's stability." Yet, despite all the warning, Russian warning, and everything else, we have United States constantly moving forward, expanding the NATO countries literally into the doorstep of the Soviet Union. So NATO has a prominent role here that we must address by itself, but if it played any role during the Cold War, which was ultimately to strangle the Soviet Union, the same policy is being pursued these days, particularly after the paper that you referred to, and by Rand and other organizations that specifically, they specifically mentioned China and Russia, that we have to do everything possible to strangle and literally limit the role of these countries and weaken them as a possible challenge to United States supremacy. You want to say anything?
Yeah, couple of points in response. First, I want to go back to 1991 and 1992 again, because it's not just that at that time, the Project for a New American Century was talking about stopping the emergence of any major competitor to U.S. power. But in 1990, when German unification took place, it was accompanied with promises by both the Bush administration and by the German government and by NATO at the time. Not just spoken ones. There's a famous statement that Gorbachev and Bush shook hands, and that Gorbachev should have known better, that was such an informal thing. But really, there were formal statements that were made, and they exist, that there would be no NATO expansion. All right, and then in 1997, NATO expansion begins. It happens in different waves, but the bottom line is that if you add Finland and Sweden's attempt, I don't know what's going to happen with it, to enter NATO. There are 16 new countries. There are 16 new countries in NATO. Now, when even Yeltsin, when he wasn't in his drunken stupor, which wasn't very often, he was very upset with this, and he raised this with the Clinton administration. What the Clinton administration said is, well, this expansion has nothing to do with a challenge from Russia. No, this expansion is because we're worried about Iran. Now that was a pretty weak argument, quite frankly, nonsensical argument. It was quite clear that what was happening was that NATO was moving into a position to do more destabilization in Russia and to create more problems. So we have this long history. I wanted to say a word about Burns, about William Burns.
One thing before you go on,
Yeah.
Rob. It's not only the declassified documents that show that the Western leaders promised the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, and others that there will not be any Eastern expansion. There were a number of, not only expansion took place, United States in particular, when it came to Ukraine, actively worked for regime change. In 2014, insurrection, which was backed by United States, and overthrow of, yes, corrupt but democratically elected government of Ukraine, and replacing it by what? A neo-Nazi organized murderous program. I mean, a government that has these kind of policies. And when this led to conflict between various minorities within Ukraine, the Minsk agreement that came between an agreement that some kind of framework for federalization of Ukraine, United States, again, by sending heavy weapons and other things, prevented from Minsk agreement to come into effect.
Right. Well, there's so much to say about about NATO and its role. What I want to the framework I want to give it is, the more that we look at this war, this special military operation that Russia's conducting in Ukraine, the more our whole understanding of what the war is has changed. So, for example, the way our media plays it, the mainstream narrative, this is a Russian invasion of Ukraine, again, without any of the historical context. But if you look more closely and you look at the background, really, this is a NATO war. All right, this is not a war. Oh yes, there's fighting that's going on, and the fighting is going on between the Ukrainian government in Kiev and the Russians and the breakaway republics in the Donbass. Yes, but when we talk about the Ukrainian military, we're talking about a military that has been armed, trained, advised, and financed by NATO, and particularly by the United States and Great Britain. So this is, we refer to it as a proxy war. So a proxy war, for those of you unfamiliar, is, it looks like that there's a fighting going on one side, if you like, but really there's somebody behind the screen that's pulling all the strings. So this is a war that started in Washington, D.C., and basically the puppet is the Ukrainian government, and the victims of this war are going to be the Ukrainian government.
Rob, today, I believe, or yesterday, Lavrov in Tehran made reference to the same thing, that if it wasn't for United States and Britain, that they are pushing Kiev not to come to negotiating table with Russia, the matter would have been resolved by probably a month ago, and everything was done by United States and United Kingdom not to allow Kiev to negotiate.
To prolong the war. Yeah,
Which
the
means
constant visits to
it
Kiev.
underscores your point that this conflict is not between Kiev and Moscow or between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine is a proxy in this war between United States and Russia, part of the attempt to weaken, strangle, and destroy Russia and make them a second or third rate country. Kissinger in Savo, what was it, the last meeting they had, Savos or Davos, in Davos?
Davos.
In Davos. Kissinger made the same thing, that he said, made a reference that this is the biggest mistake. If you are trying to weaken Russia, Russia is going to turn to east towards China, where China is the main enemy, and you are strengthening both China and Russia because now uniting their front. So you are quite right when you say that this is not a war between Ukraine and Russia. It's between United States and Russia, and it is unfortunately Ukrainians are doing the dirty work, and they are paying the price for it.
Playing it terrible. We will talk in our next segment on the specifics of the war. But what I want to talk about now is this whole goal of using Ukraine to destabilize Russia, because that's really what this war is about. And the effort to destabilize Russia is an attempt to break down this growing cooperation, strengthening of the relations between Russia and China, and those who entered into this war, their thinking was that of the two, Russia is the weaker link, and so if Russia can be brought down, then China is more isolated. And there actually are a number of papers, again, Rand Corporation papers, and in these papers, what they talk about is the partition of Russia into 5 or 6 smaller units, and the way they put it, that are more, quote, easily manageable. Meaning what? More easily manageable for American oil and gas and mineral companies to extract the wealth of Russia than having to deal with a strong centralized Russian government. So this isn't conspiracy stuff. This is plans. And once again, we've seen this in the Middle East, Ibrahim. We've seen it in Iraq and in Syria and in Libya. That part of the military effort here to pulverize those countries is to partition them, either de facto, i.e. legally, or in practice, or legally de jure. And so they're really applying, if you like, a similar logic to Russia. But what gets me is that their failure to appreciate the strength of Russia. They really, and this is a classic American foreign policy issue. They underestimate their opponents. And now they're paying a price for that, right?
Because the United States still sees Russia as Yeltsin Day.
That's right.
Some paralyzed leader that most of the time was drunk. And by the way, for those people who think that this is fanciful idea, they only need to go back to 2003. Within a year of occupying Iraq, we had military and CIA papers coming out, literally dividing Iraq into 3 zones. They did the same thing during the Doha contract
for Syria
conference about Syria. You can have a look at that paper. You look at the paper that came out about Libya, again, immediately, as now they have done it. They have broken the country into pieces, which is more manageable by removing the resources, oil and gas and everything else. But they care less about the population. They do the same. They did the same thing, or at least they hope to achieve the same thing in Yemen. So this notion is not new.
Right.
If United States is unable to do it itself, they don't want to put the troop on the ground. NATO troop will be doing the dirty job as they did it in Libya.
I wanted to. I've been reading been watching. There's a commentator, a former military guy, actually, who is a former nuclear weapons investigator in Iraq, and that's Scott Ritter. And Scott Ritter he's on social media. He's all over the place. He's an interesting guy. He's not a lightweight, either politically or militarily. But I was looking at some of the things he was saying about NATO, and what he's looking at, he thinks that this war in Ukraine, it's not only going to be a debacle for the Kiev government, it's going to be a debacle for Europe, and he argues it's going to be the beginning of the downfall of NATO, and that NATO will not recover from this because NATO has been exposed in this war, this war in Ukraine, for its weaknesses, for its using cannon fodder, the people of Ukraine, and the size of the debacle, both military and political. I mean, it remains to be seen, but it looks to be quite serious. And so this is kind of like the emperor with no clothes, or the elephant in the room, if you like, the dying elephant in the room. So Ibrahim, we want to keep these interviews to a certain time limit, and we're just about there. Do you have any kind of concluding remarks that you want to make before we close?
Well, the only thing which I would like to add briefly is for the listeners to do a little bit of investigation and see the result of this war or conflict. United States and Europe, this is underscoring the point you just raised, that the conflict is undermining Europe and NATO, and ultimately would undermine and weaken Europe. European, particularly Germany and few other countries, their significance is based on their economy. And the economy is being hit beyond belief. All of the Europeans' economy is being hit.
Yeah.
The inflation, the price on the fuel, food, and everything else, even weakening of their currency. Look at on the other side. What do you see? Ruble, highest level over the past 10 years. Right. Income from a sale of oil and gas to East has increased the gold capacity of Russia beyond belief. Russia is in much stronger position now than it was almost 4 months ago. So to realize that the narrative of breaking of Russia's back and ultimately capitulating is not going to happen. It's fanciful.
And it's backfiring.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
We can do, the next episode we can add or clarify some other points.
All right. So my final comment is, from the very beginning of this conflict, we have argued that war is not in the interest of either party, and there has to be a negotiated settlement. Every time there's been a negotiated settlement, what has happened is that the United States and Great Britain, NATO, have really discouraged the Kiev government from entering into these negotiations. The most recent one was this Minsk II agreement. Had Ukraine entered into the Minsk II agreement and had they come to some understanding, it's highly likely that the Donbass republics, and I'm not sure about the Crimea, but the Donbass republics probably would be part of the Ukraine. Today, that's history. The real question is, how much more of you is Ukraine willing to lose? Ukraine, this is not a war that Ukraine or NATO can win. It's time for them to negotiate. It's true that that in these negotiations, they're not going to do real well. However, they can come out of it at least a nation intact. The more that this war continues, the less likely that is to happen. So on that note, friends, I want to thank you for listening. We're gonna circulate this a little bit, and then in a few weeks we'll do the last segment of the series. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ibrahim. Of course.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you.
For participating. So good night, everybody. Take care. We'll see you.
Good night.
Good night. Okay.